Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, did anyone have any technical difficulty getting into the Zoom today? No? Okay. So, we are now studying Parshah Vayeira, which, if you're in the Blue Art Scroll Chumash, is found on page 78. And another incredible Torah portion with major events and very, very important and fundamental aspects of Judaism, because we're learning about the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Our rabbis tell us, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, which means all the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs are not just stories, they're signs and indicators and guidelines for all future generations, for their children, for their descendants. So even though these stories happened 3,800 years ago with Abraham and Sarah, they remain instructive and directive to all of our lives. So they're not just stories, they're fundamental, foundational stories for the Jewish people. And of course, by extension, for all of humanity. So the opening story of the Torah portion is a sequel to the end of last week's Torah portion. The end of last week's Torah portion, God appeared to Abraham and instructed him to circumcise himself. And we know that Abraham followed through with God's commandment and circumcised himself at the age of 99 years old. And God now appears to Abraham after he underwent circumcision and visits him. So Abraham's sitting by the door of his tent, and God appears and visits Abraham. Why is God visiting Abraham? So rabbis say, because we know there's a mitzvah of bikur cholim. When someone is ill, you pay them a visit. Why? Because not only does it cheer them up, but our rabbis say it actually takes away a portion, a measure of their illness. So here God himself is paying a visit to Abraham to see how he's recuperating from the surgery of Brit Milah. And here Abraham's conversing with God when suddenly he sees three strangers walking down the road. And something absolutely incredible happens. I don't know if any other religion would tell a story like this. But again, this is what is unique about Judaism. God is talking to Abraham, and Abraham says to God, and I'm going to quote the words, God, if I find favor in your eyes, al na tavor me'alavdecha. Do not pass by, meaning wait here a minute. And God is kept waiting as Abraham runs to welcome and greet the three guests to invite them into his house. And then when the guests agree to enter into Abraham's home to be his guests, he runs into the house, into the tent, and tells his wife Sarah, prepare a meal, get some cakes ready, bread. Then he runs to his son Yishmael. He says, go get a good calf to slaughter. And then while they're waiting for the animal to be slaughtered and prepared, he serves them milk and meat, of course, waiting the time between the milk and the meat. And he stands over his guests and he serves them. Now, obviously, this is the mitzvah of Hachnasat Orchim, welcoming guests into your home, one of the greatest mitzvahs. But what's remarkable about the story is, A, that Abraham's 99 years old, and he just underwent a circumcision. And yet he's personally involved in the mitzvah bikur of Hachnasat Orchim, of welcoming guests into his house. But what's more remarkable is that he was talking to God. And he tells God to wait while he takes care of the guests. And our rabbis actually learn from this story that if you have someone in front of you that you need to be of service to, that needs your help, no matter what you're doing, you stop to help the person in need, even if what you're doing is talking to God himself. Why is that so? Because in Judaism, of course, everything begins with creation of man. And what does God say? Let us make man in our image, meaning in the image of God. Every person has a part of God in them. So when you care for another human being, you're actually caring for God himself. And therefore, God says, by all means, let me wait while you take care of my children. Imagine you were talking to someone and the person says, oh, I need to go help someone. And the person they're going to help is your child. You would never be disappointed that they're cutting the conversation short to go help your child, because that's wonderful that you're going to help my child. So too, God says, if you're going to help a fellow human being who's in need, like these three strangers who are passing by, then I'll wait while you take care of that. That's more important. So remember always that sometimes we feel I'm too busy now. I'm doing something too important than to help another person. But the Torah tells us no matter what you're doing, you always stop to help a person in need. And I remember there's a story once, there was a man sitting at the dinner table one night with his whole family. And there's a knock on the door. There was a poor man who needed some charity. And the man said, he left his family at the dining room table and he went into his office. He sat the man down to listen to what he needs and then to help him out with financial assistance. But the poor man felt really bad because he saw that the whole family was sitting at the dining table. All his children, he's taking them away from dinner. You know, the worst thing you can do is call someone during dinner time, right? So he said to the man of the house, he said, listen, I'll come back later. You're in the middle of dinner. I don't want to disturb your dinner. You could help me later. And the man said to the poor man, he said, no, I want you to stay and I want to help you now. And he said, let me tell you why. He says, never in my life did I ever, in the middle of a dinner table, say, you know, I got to get up and go to my office because I have to pay some bills. Never in my life, in the middle of a dinner, did I say, you know, I got to get up now, in the middle of dinner. I'll be back. I got to go fix something that's broken in the house. My family knows the most important thing is I'm sitting with my family at dinner. I'm not going to leave the middle of dinner to do anything else. He said, but there's one thing that I want my kids to see, that no matter what you're doing, you get up and you help others. And I want my kids to see that, yes, when a poor man comes to the house and needs something, no matter what you're doing, you stop and you help that person in need. So much so, even when it's a question of speaking to God, God says, I'll wait while you help another person. You know, today, we have a lot of technology, and sometimes, you know, we're multitasking and we're like on the phone and we have call waiting and we see someone else is calling and we put someone on hold to go talk to someone else. And sometimes we like don't give people the proper time or proper respect. And what Hashem is saying is that respecting and welcoming another person is so important that it's worth even making God wait. So there's no one more important than the person in front of you that needs your help right now. There's a story, the Baal Shem Tov was once sitting with his students learning, and a man's horse and buggy got stuck in the mud and he needed help getting it out. And they came to the poor man, the villager came to the synagogue where the students were studying, and he said, can I get some help? And in Russian, I forgot how they said it. They said, we can't help you. And the poor man or the villager whose horse and buggy got stuck in the mud said, help, you can help, but you don't want to help. So we always have to remember the difference between not being able to and not willing to do it. Avram is an amazing example. He could have said, well, I just had a circumcision. I'm 99 years old. I need to rest. I can't be taking care of guests right now. But of course, and this is a trait that Avram Avinu bequeathed to all future generations of Jews until today, to be hospitable, to be welcoming, to always invite people into your guest home. And it's actually really beautiful to see the hospitality that Jewish communities show whenever there's a guest in town, finding them a place to stay, a place to eat. If you've ever been to Israel, I always love to talk about how Friday night at the Kotel, there's a man, Jeff Seidel, who stands by the Kotel, and anyone who needs a place to eat for Shabbat dinner, he has a long list of names of families that are open to receiving guests, and he sends guests to people's homes, strangers, to go to other people's homes to eat for Shabbat meal, because someone needs a place to eat for Shabbat, sure, come to my house. And it's very common to go to a Jewish home and see lots of guests, visitors in town, people who just came through who don't even know the host, but they're eating at their table because they're a guest in town. And that's something very unusual in today's modern day and age. Even at weddings, I've said this before, but in the religious community where I come from, when you make a wedding, in addition to your guests, you set a table for people who need a place to eat. And poor people in the community, this is like the wedding of Dini and I, and every wedding in Crown Heights or Borough Park, there's a special table where anyone who needs a place to eat can just come in and sit down and have a meal. Imagine showing up at the Breakers and saying, they say, well, can we help you? You say, well, we came to eat dinner at the wedding tonight. Who are you? I'm just a poor person, needs a place to eat. I'm hungry. I'm a visitor in town. I don't have where to eat. It's unbelievable the amount of hachnasat orchim, hospitality, that takes place in Jewish communities. And again, most people at their table, they have family, they have friends, or maybe if your family recommended someone who needs a place, but to just invite, absolutely. Thanks for letting me know my video stopped. I didn't realize. Just to invite complete strangers into your home is a tremendous mitzvah. And that is the mitzvah of Achnasat Orchim. I'll tell you a great story. There's so many stories about Achnasat Orchim, two that just popped into my mind. It's a true story. I don't remember exactly where it happened, but this happened many times. There are many times where there's flights that suddenly, last minute on Friday, they have to get rerouted somewhere because there's a problem landing or whatever. And there's religious Jews on the plane and it's Shabbat and they don't know what to do. So there was a story once that there was a group of a couple of religious people on a plane. They're going to be landing and the plane had to do an emergency landing somewhere in some other city. So they called the local rabbi from the plane saying, we got like 6 different people who need a place for Shabbat. And from the air, the rabbi arranged different homes that when they land, they should take taxis to these different homes that were going to invite them for Shabbat. And one of the religious passengers sat down in a seat after arranging all of this. And the guy said, what's going on? He said, well, we're observant. We need a place for Shabbat. So he called the local rabbi. He found those 6 different homes. And they said, you're just going to go to some stranger's home? Well, how could you trust that? To go to anyone or some random person that you don't even know? But to us, this is very familiar. One other story I once heard was that there was this rabbi who a poor man knocked on his door and he needed a place to stay. And he said, come on in. And he said, let me give you a meal. And he served him a whole meal. And then he said, it was a winter night when he was about to leave. He said, do you need a place to sleep? He says, yes, I do. I don't have where to sleep. He says, come, I'll give you a room and a bed. and he set him up for the night. When the rabbi came down, his elderly father was with him in the house. And his father said, "You did a good job with taking care of the guests, but you could have done better." He said, "I could have done better. What more could I have done? I fed him a meal, and then I gave him a room to sleep." And the father said, when you invited him in for the meal, you should have asked him right up front, "Do you have a place to sleep tonight?" And when he would have told you no, you could have told him, "Listen, after dinner, don't worry, I have a place for you to sleep." Instead, you first gave him the meal, and only at the end of the meal, you asked him if he has a place to sleep. So while he really enjoyed the meal, he really didn't enjoy it fully because he was worried that after the meal is over, he has to head out on the road in the middle of the night on a cold winter night without a place to sleep. He would have enjoyed his meal much more had you reassured him that he'll have a place to sleep afterwards as well. So no matter how well we do the mitzvah of hospitality, hopefully all of us are good hosts when we have guests. But there's always higher levels of hospitality. It says in Pirkei Avot, the poor people should be members of your household. What does it mean the poor people should be members of your household? So what the rabbis are saying is not just that you should welcome guests into your house, but when your guests come to your house, they should feel like they're members of your household. Just like when you're in your own house, you feel completely at home. When you're a member of a household, you feel completely welcomed. You're wanted there. You're not a burden on the family. You could help yourself to anything you want. You could go to the refrigerator door, look at what's there, and take what you want. So too, you should make your guests, the poor people, feel like they're members of your household. They should feel as welcome as members of their own house. So welcoming guests is more than just giving them to eat, but making them truly feel embraced, and that it's not a burden for you to have them, but it's a pleasure and a joy for you to have them at your home. So that is the opening story of Abraham and his guests. Turns out that these three guests were not ordinary guests. Who are they? They were three angels. And here we come to the next amazing story in this week's Torah portion. God sends three angels. One angel to heal Abraham from the circumcision. The second angel to notify Abraham and Sarah they're going to have a baby. After the Brit Milah, they were going to merit to have a child. And the third one was on their way to destroy the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, of Sodom and Amorah, because the cruelty of the people was so great. And by the way, what was their cruelty? They forbade guests. They said, if you feed guests or poor people, they're going to come back again and again. They're going to be a burden on our community and our society. No fundraising in this town. No charities allowed. No guests are allowed in the home. And God said, such a cruel society, I'm going to destroy the cities. But Lot, family, one of the angels went to save them. And at the end, only Lot escaped because the family members didn't want to leave. And the wife left, but she looked back and turned into a pillar of salt, as we know. But the next amazing story that emerges in our Torah portion, again, the first one is hospitality. Now we come to the story of Abraham praying for the wicked people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'm sure everyone knows the story. God says, am I going to hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? I better tell him. And God tells him, here's what I plan on doing. I plan on destroying the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham steps forward and starts to plead, to pray, to negotiate with God. And he says, God, how could you destroy the righteous together with the wicked? You're the judge of the whole world. How could you commit such an injustice to destroy the righteous with the wicked? And he says, God, if I could find 50 righteous people, will you spare the cities? And God says, yes. And he looks, he can't even find 50 righteous people. And he says to God, what's if I could find 45? And God says, yes, I'll spare the cities. And then he can't find 45, and then 40, and 30, and 20. And then he says, God, what's if I find 10 righteous people? Will you save the cities? And God said, yes. And when Abraham couldn't even find 10 righteous people, that's when God destroys the cities of Sodom and Amorah. And again, an amazing story. Abraham is praying for the wicked people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham teaches us again, what does it mean to be a Jew? You know, if you look at all the stories from the beginning of the Torah till now, is there a theme in all these stories? And the answer is yes, there is a theme. And the theme is that God gives man free choice. And unfortunately, there's a series of stories of man not living up to the proper choices that they're supposed to make. So let's look at the stories. The first story is God tells Adam and Eve, you can eat from all the trees, but don't eat from the tree of knowledge. And of course, they make the wrong choice. The snake, the serpent entices Eve, Eve entices Adam, and they eat from it. Now, that in itself is a sin. They didn't follow what God told them to do. They didn't exercise their free choice properly. They succumbed to the temptation. But here's what happens next. When God confronts Adam and Eve and says, why did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from? Do they take responsibility? You see, there's two things. One thing is if you made a mistake, you did the wrong thing. And we're all human. We make mistakes. We sometimes do the wrong thing. But then the bigger question is, do you take responsibility for what you've done wrong and try to correct it? And what happens when God comes to Adam and says, why did you eat from it? What does Adam say? The woman you gave me, she made me do it. She gave it to me. He blames her. And then when she is asked by God, did you eat from the tree that I told you not to? She says, the serpent made me do it. In other words, they're not taking responsibility for their actions. They're not taking personal accountability and responsibility. And that story teaches us lesson number one in life. Every person, first and foremost, has to be responsible for their own actions. You are the only one responsible for your actions. You can't blame others, no matter how difficult your situation was, no matter how much pressure you had. You're responsible. You have free choice. And therefore, unlike Adam and Eve, who blamed others, we have to look into ourselves and say, if I did something wrong, I got to own it. I got to fix it. I got to do teshuvah. It's on me, no one else. That's lesson number one. The next major story in the Torah is Cain and Abel. We all know what happens. Cain gets jealous of his brother and he murders his brother. And when God comes to Cain and says, where's your brother? Just like when God came to Adam and Eve and said, where are you? God introduces it with a question. What does Cain say to God? Famous answer. Am I my brother's keeper? In other words, he's saying, yeah, I killed my brother, but I'm not responsible. There's nothing wrong with that. In other words, I don't feel morally responsible to protect his life. I don't owe him anything. In other words, he's not saying I didn't kill him. He's saying, am I my brother's keeper? Do I have to watch out and be responsible for my brother's life? So here we have the second level of responsibility. The first level is personal responsibility, but it doesn't end with personal responsibility. After you take responsibility for yourself, you then have a moral obligation to be responsible for others around you. We as human beings all understand that. We can't be bystanders, we have to be upstanders. So that story is a failing in moral responsibility. Then we come to the third story, Noah. Noah took personal responsibility. He was a righteous man. And he was responsible for his brother, meaning he didn't say, am I my brother's keeper? He made sure that every member of his family was righteous. However, he doesn't save anyone else in the larger, greater society. He lets the world be flooded. In other words, he takes personal responsibility. He takes moral responsibility for his family. Unlike Cain, who said, am I my brother's keeper? Didn't care about his brother. But he doesn't take collective, communal responsibility. In other words, his responsibility only extends to his family, but not beyond. So once again, the world is flooded, and Noah does not emerge as the great founder of Judaism, it's only Abraham in this week's Torah portion who's selected to be the forefather, the patriarch of the Jewish nation. Why Abraham? So now let's look at Abraham's life and see how he defines and personifies the value of accountability and responsibility. Abraham grew up in a home filled with idolatry, paganism, but he came to the conclusion on his own that there's only one God. There's only one God, and therefore he smashed the idols of his father, stood up to his whole society and said, I'm responsible for my actions. And just because I grew up in a home and an environment which was idolatrous, that doesn't exonerate me from doing what's right. And he stands up and worships one God. So he shows the idea of personal responsibility. He could have said, well, my father taught me to worship idols. That's what everyone else is doing around me. No, I'm responsible for myself. But he doesn't stop there. He then starts influencing others, teaching others about God, showing the idea of I am my brother's keeper. I am responsible morally for my fellow man. But the ultimate story is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where he's praying on behalf of the wicked people. You see, Noah didn't pray for the wicked people of his generation. He let them get flooded and drowned and destroyed in the flood. Abraham is the opposite of Noah. He pleads and he prays with God, saying, save these people. There's still hope for them. If I could find 10 righteous people, they could save the city by making it better. In other words, Abraham takes responsibility, not just for himself, not just for his family, but for the whole society, for all the people, even wicked people like Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's a very powerful lesson that we learn from Abraham. And like I said, these are very fundamental stories. And one of the reasons it's so fundamental is because there's something very unprecedented in this story. You know, Noah also feared God. Noah also was righteous. But he was a very obedient person. And if God told him, go into the ark, lock the door, and I'm going to flood the world, that's what he did. We don't find that Noah protests or challenges or questions God about his plan. We don't find Noah doing what Abraham does, saying, God, how could you destroy all of humanity? What about the righteous people? Abraham has the audacity, in a good way, to stand up and protest God. I mean, we all know what a protest is. People go out and they protest things, but we protest other human beings. Imagine protesting against God. That's what Abraham's doing. He's saying, quote the words of Abraham. He says, will the God of justice do something unjust? He's accusing God of doing something unjust. How could you destroy indiscriminately an entire city? What about the righteous, 50 righteous people that are going to die, or 45 or 40? In other words, he's saying to God, God, you can't do this. This is wrong. It's not fair. And this is very, very Jewish. Moses is going to do it later with the golden calf. That we as Jews, Jacob was called Yisrael because he wrestled with the angel, which means he was able to wrestle even with the divine. Yes, we are allowed to wrestle with God. In our prayers, we could say to God, God, how could you make this person sick? They're such a good person. They've done so much. That's not fair. Moses says to God when he wanted to destroy the Jews after the golden calf, what are the nations of the world going to say? You took them out of Egypt to slaughter them in the desert. In other words, we're allowed to protest and wrestle and challenge God himself. And not only allowed to, we're supposed to. And that's why God told Abraham. What does it mean God says to Abraham? Torah says, God says, am I going to hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? In other words, why is he telling Abraham? He's telling Abraham because he wants Abraham to protest. I'll give you a simple analogy. If you're a parent and one of your children does something wrong, and you say to that child, okay, you're punished. You can't go play tonight. You can't, you have to go to bed early. Like you give a punishment. And one of your other children stands up like a defense attorney and starts arguing on behalf of the other child, saying, how could you do that? He doesn't deserve this punishment. Starts defending him. Would you get upset at the other child? Or would you be happy in your heart of hearts? As a parent, I think you would be happy. Why? Because when you see the way one child loves and cares about the other child and doesn't want the other child to get punished, that shows you that your children love each other, and that makes you happy. And that's what Hashem was doing. He was telling Abraham what he's going to do because he wanted to see if Abraham was going to stand up and protest and try to save and defend others. And that's the idea of responsibility. The idea of responsibility is to not just be, famous teaching in Pirkei Avot. I think everyone knows this. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? In other words, we all have to take responsibility for ourselves. Then our next circle of influence, our families, our community, our society. You have to start with yourself, by the way. It's a famous story of Yisrael Salanter once said, a great rabbi said, when I was young, I said, I'm going to change the whole world. Then I got a little older, I realized it's very hard to change the whole world. So I decided I'm going to change my country. Then I realized that's too hard. I said, you know what, I'm going to change my community. Then I realized that's too hard. I decided, you know what, I'm going to change my family. And then I realized that's too hard. So I said to myself, you know what, let me change myself. And if I change myself, then I'll be able to change my family, my community, my society, my country, and the world. You have to start with personal responsibility. That's number one, what Abraham did. But then you can't stop there. You have to go to your family, your community, your society. And that's the idea of responsibility. But the ultimate story of responsibility is going to be at the end of this week's Torah portion. The end of this week's Torah portion has a story that is perhaps, we'll get back to the rest of the Torah portion because there's so much more to talk about, but on the subject of responsibility, what does responsibility mean? The ability to respond, to answer the call. Whatever God calls on you to do, I answer, I respond. I'll tell you something interesting. The word humility in Hebrew is anav. Now, what does humility mean? Humility, in English, people think it means, someone said a beautiful definition. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking less about yourself. It's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking less about yourself. But humility doesn't mean that I'm small and I can't do anything. The word anav in Hebrew is from the word anu, which means to answer. When you're humble, you do what God asks you to do. You answer God's call because it's not about you, it's about what God wants you to do. So humility doesn't mean I'm weak or I'm small. It means I'm so great that I can answer God's call, that I am being called upon, and I will answer that call because I have the ability to do something great. So it's not that you don't believe in yourself. It means that you don't put yourself before the call of the hour. Whether you're being called by others to help or by God, whatever the calling is, you respond. That's responsibility, the ability to respond. So we already showed Abraham responded to his personal call for his brother's keeper, for his society, prayed for Sodom and Gomorrah. But the ultimate call comes at the end of this week's Torah portion. This is what really solidified the role of Abraham as the patriarch, the founding father of the Jewish nation. It's this story, the 10th and last trial that God gave Abraham. And what is it? Famous story, we all know it. It's such a famous story because it's a very controversial story. And maybe more commentary was written on this story than any other story in the Torah. And it's, of course, the story of the Akedah, as it's known in Hebrew, the binding of Isaac. Very complex, very challenging, in certain ways, very troubling story, but a story that is a cornerstone of the foundation of the Jewish nationhood. So much so that when we blow the ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah, It's to remind us of the story of the binding of Isaac, which we actually read in the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. And it's from this week's Torah portion. I don't have to tell you the story. God comes to Abraham and says, go to Mount Moriah, take your beloved son Isaac, and offer him up as an elevation offering. Basically, to sacrifice Isaac. Now, the whole idea of human sacrifice is obviously very troubling because we know that throughout the Torah prohibits human sacrifices, God forbid. That's what the other nations did. But God says, I want to see if you're willing to give up your most beloved child, your only child, from Sarah. And in the beginning of the story, it says God tested Abraham. It was merely a test, but Abraham didn't know it's a test. And Abraham takes the son Isaac, and they go to Mount Moriah, and we all know the story. He binds him on the altar, and he lifts up the knife, ready to slaughter his son, when an angel comes and says, don't touch the lad. Do not lay your hand upon the child. Don't do anything at all. It was only a test. And now that God sees that you're willing to give up the thing you love the most, your child, now God knows you're truly God-fearing, and indeed, God will make you the father of the great nation, the Jewish people. So obviously this story has many, many different details that are analyzed, and much too much for us to go into all the details, obviously. My daughter Hindi was just telling me that she was reading yesterday. She's going to talk about it at the Lunch and Learn tomorrow, so you may want to come because she's giving the class tomorrow at the Parshah at the Paramount. But Elie Wiesel wrote a great deal about the Akedah, and he talked about the Holocaust being the Akedah of our generation. And indeed, in the Holocaust, many people lost their lives, but also their children's lives. They lost their children in the name of being Jewish. So he talks about what does it mean to be like Isaac, to be a survivor, to come through the Akedah as he did. So I'll let Hindi take it from that direction. But just some fundamental ideas about the story of the Akedah. First of all, why is this the ultimate test? Well, the obvious reason, your child you love more than anything else. But it's much more than that. You see, what did God promise Abraham? Your children will be like the stars in the heaven, the sand on the seashore. You're going to have a child, Isaac, and from him the Jewish nation will come out. So on one hand, God told him you're going to have a child, Isaac, and Isaac will be the progenitor of the Jewish nation. Now God says, take that son and sacrifice him. Now imagine what's going on in Abraham's mind. If I sacrifice Isaac, that's the end of my future generations, because Isaac wasn't married then. So obviously there's no descendants after Isaac. If Isaac sacrificed, that spells the end of the Jewish people. Abraham's great vision and faith and ideology and has not have any continuity. So he's not only killing his son, he's killing his future, his lineage. The very creation of the Jewish nation is being sacrificed. And Abraham could have said to God, God, I'm confused. On one hand, you told me I'm going to have a great nation come out of Isaac. Now then you told me to sacrifice him. How's this going to work? But that's precisely what the test was. The test was, how is Abraham going to handle that uncertainty? On the one hand, I'm told I'm going to have a nation. On the other hand, I'm told to sacrifice Isaac. How is this going to work? Abraham had no idea, but he still went ahead with the mission, trusting in God. And here you take this huge story of the blinding of Isaac that none of us could even think of doing, because we're not Abraham and we didn't hear a commandment directly from God. But now we understand what Akedah means. It's the story of how do we have faith in the face of uncertainty. All of us face situations in life where we don't understand how things are going to work out. And we cannot see the outcome. And those are the times where it's sometimes hardest to have faith. But to have faith and say, look, I don't know how it's going to work out. I don't know how it's going to get resolved. It's confusing. On the one hand, God said, I'm going to have a great nation. On the other hand, he told me sacrifice it, but I still have faith in God. I haven't lost my faith. To be able to deal with challenges and keep your faith, even though things are very blurry and confusing and you can't understand the outcome, how it's going to work, but just believe there will be a positive outcome. That's what faith is. And indeed, God comes to Abraham and says, don't touch the lad, take the ram in the thicket and offer it as a sacrifice instead. That's one very powerful idea of the Akedah. The other one is the obvious one, which is how far are you willing to go for God? Is there any time that you draw the line and say, this I'm not willing to give for God? You know, people say, I'm willing to do so much, but that's too much. Abraham says, I'm willing to go as far as God asks me to go. I'm willing to give it all up, even if it means my beloved child. In other words, I'm willing to relinquish everything, even the things that are the thing that is the most dear to and precious to me. I'm willing to give that up. So again, we're not Abraham and we're not expected to even be tested on that level. But, you know, there's a story that in the Russian, during communism, the Russian party leaders called all the people together and they said, they were talking to this Jew, Moshe. They say, Moshe, if you had 10 horses, would you be willing to give up 10 horses for the Communist Party? He said, yeah, absolutely. They said, would you be willing to give up 5 cows? He said, yeah, absolutely. They said, were you willing to give up 3 donkeys? Yeah, for sure. Then they said, would you be willing to give up 2 chickens? He said, no, that I'm not willing to do. They said, what? 10 horses, 5 cows, 3 donkeys. You're willing to give? 2 chickens you're not willing to give? And Moshe said, that's right, because I actually have 2 chickens. You know, in theory, you can give up anything, but what I have, am I willing to give it up? So what the story of the binding of Isaac challenges us, according to Maimonides, to ask ourselves, is there something I would not be willing to give up for God? Where do I draw the line? And Abraham, of course, that's why he's Abraham, says, I don't draw the line anywhere, even if it means my child. Now, someone say, willing to murder a human being, how could that be? Especially because Abraham taught people not to murder their children. But that's why it's such a great challenge. You see, what's the hardest thing to give up in life? The hardest thing to give up is your reasoning, your beliefs, your understanding of things. You know, if you think about life and death, right? Many people in history and many people today are willing to die for what they believe in. When you go to be a soldier for your country, whether it's America or the IDF, what you're saying is, I'm ready to give my life for this cause. Because I believe in the greater purpose of my mission, that my life is worth sacrificing for the purpose of preserving freedom, whether it's a soldier in the United States or a soldier in the IDF. And parents who allow their children to go serve in the army are also saying that. They're saying, I'm willing to let my child go fight, and I know there's a possibility they can die. But the purpose of being for this cause is worth it. There are people who ran into burning buildings on 9/11 to save strangers. They knew they're risking their lives, but they felt it was worth it to save these innocent lives. Every one of us could be in a situation where we're willing to risk our life to save someone else because we understand why we're doing it and we believe it's worth paying the price. So Abraham is not unique in the fact that he's willing to sacrifice his child's life. But that's if you're sacrificing it for something that makes sense. something that's rational, something that has a purpose, that has a meaning, that has a greater good. But here, it's the opposite. It goes against everything you believe in. It's murder. And in a sense, that's what the ultimate test is. The greatest faculty we have is our mind. And when you're willing to even transcend your own logic and understanding, and again, we weren't communicated by, well, what about radicals who believe that they're allowed to kill? Well, God didn't come and speak to them personally and directly tell them to do this. But if you were revealed, had a revelation from God, and God said, do this, are you willing to give up your understanding for a higher understanding and even be accused of being a hypocrite? Because up until that point, Abraham taught everyone not to do that. And that's the whole punchline of the story. The whole punchline is God is making a statement for now and forever. No, human sacrifice is forbidden. We're a religion of life, not a religion of death. We never take a human life in the name of God, like some other corrupt religions do. Because God celebrates life, and Judaism celebrates life, and life is sacred and should never be sacrificed, even on a higher altar. And this is the conclusion of the story and the lesson it teaches us up until today. But there's one other dimension of the binding of Isaac. Very interestingly, Abraham gets a new name in this week's Torah portion. Instead of being called Avram without the letter Hey, he's given the letter Hey, which means that his name now means you will be a father of many nations, which he became the father of many nations. And God actually gives the reason why Abraham was chosen. We know why Noah was chosen. It says he was a righteous man. We know why Moses was chosen. He stood up for the Jews in Egypt. Why was Abraham chosen? And the answer is actually in this week's Torah portion, where God says to Abraham, you know why I've chosen you? Because you will instruct your children and your descendants after you to follow in the ways of God. In other words, fascinatingly, the reason Abraham was chosen was because he said, Abraham, you are going to be a great father. What does it mean, a father? Not just that you're going to give birth to nations, but you're going to teach your descendants to follow in the ways of God. So Abraham is chosen because of the virtue of being a good parent, being a good father. As God says, you were chosen because you instruct your family and your descendants after you to follow in the ways of God. Now, it's interesting that why was Eve called Eve? Chava, because you're the mother of all life. Again, the idea of being a parent. Judaism, of course, celebrates being a father and being a mother, but not just in the biological sense, but in instructing your children, your grandchildren, or your disciples, because disciples are students, are like children. But here's the amazing thing about Abraham. Abraham is Abraham, the father of many great nations. He's the ultimate father. He instilled and communicated to his descendants for future generations the virtues of believing in God, having faith, and loving kindness, chesed, hospitality, and other forms of kindness. So he's the ultimate father. But in order to become the ultimate father, he began with Lech Lecha, leave your father's home to the land that I will show you. So the one who becomes the ultimate father has to leave his father's home. And then he's told to sacrifice his child. How could the ultimate father be a person to leave his father's home and at the same time sacrifice his child? How does that make him the ultimate father? And here's a third idea behind the story of the binding Isaac. The commentaries say that the story of the binding of Isaac is teaching is that every person is an individual. Just because you're a child doesn't mean you're the possessions of your parents, or that you have to be like your parents. Or just because you have a child doesn't mean that you have the right to coerce them to be just like you or do what you believe. It has to be the separation or the space between the parents and the child for them to choose who they want to become. And typically they'll choose to be what they were taught to be, like their parents, to follow in the traditions and their ways of the, and so on and so forth. But you have to give them that freedom and that space. And so Abraham has to leave his home to realize who he is and become the great father and the great child, because ultimately he carried on his father's journey to the land of Israel, and also become the great father by giving his son the space to become his own person. And that's why at the end of the binding, Abraham goes back without Isaac. Isaac goes off to study Torah. He finds his own path at that point. So the idea is that we don't own our children. Someone said that our children are given to us for a period of time to come through us, but not, ultimately they go off on their own. And we can't be possessive of our children. We have to realize every child has their own identity, their own calling, their own neshama. We have to allow them to have their own personal self-expression. And only by giving them that space can we then come together in a healthy manner. And that's one of the lessons of God telling Abraham to give up his child, ultimately saying it was a test, but to communicate this message that we don't own our children, because each child is really a child of God. We are given the privilege of raising these children, of educating them, of guiding them. But we have to remember ultimately that these are Hashem's children. And finally, just in conclusion, what we see from these 10 trials that God tested Abraham, starting with Lech Lecha to the land that I will show you, all the way to the story of the binding of Isaac, is that God made basically two big promises to Abraham. One is, go to the land of Israel, it'll be yours and your descendants. The second one is, I'll make you into a great nation. Now, next week, Sarah's going to die, and then Abraham's going to die. Right now, Abraham only has one Jewish child, Isaac, who's not married. Next week, we're going to read about how after Sarah's passing, Isaac's going to get married to Rebecca. And then at the end of next week's Torah portion, Abraham is going to die. But when Abraham dies, all he has is one son, one daughter-in-law, and two grandchildren, Jacob and Esau. Yet these two grandchildren become the Jewish nation till today. So God told Abraham, your children are going to be like the stars in the heaven. But in his lifetime, he really didn't see how we became a great nation. But the promise was fulfilled eventually. And in order to get to that point, he had to go through a lot of hardships till he had a child. And then, of course, the binding of Isaac, which was traumatic, where he's told to sacrifice the child. The same thing is true with the land of Israel. God says, go to the land of Israel, be yours and your descendants. Well, right now he doesn't own any of the land. Next week when Sarah dies, he buys one little parcel of land in Hebron as a burial place for his wife Sarah. But here we are today in the land of Israel, our nation, our country, our homeland. But what the story of Abraham teaches us is that just because God makes a promise to you, it doesn't mean that it's going to come easy, and it doesn't mean that it's going to come quickly. Abraham had to go through a lot of struggles, including the binding of Isaac and all the other challenges for the land of Israel and for his progeny. And it took a while till it came to be. But again, faith in God's promise means to know that if God made a promise, it's going to happen. You know, we were told Mashiach is going to come. We've been waiting in exile for so long, but we never give up on our faith. Because if God made a promise, it's going to happen, even if it takes a long time and it's a long and winding road till you get to it. But if something was promised, it will be fulfilled. Having faith is not losing trust in the promise that God made. So we have a promise the world will become a better place one day. Mashiach will come. There'll be peace on earth. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. The wolf and the lamb will lie together. There'll be peace on earth. When is this promise going to be fulfilled? Like Abraham, we have to keep our faith. And just to conclude by saying that the truth is that these two promises that God gave Abraham 3,800 years ago, the land of Israel will be yours and your descendants, and your children will be a great nation. Even till today, these two promises are the greatest struggles facing the Jewish people. If I were to ask you, 2022, what are the two biggest challenges the Jewish nation face? Well, you would say maybe anti-Semitism. You would say the security of Israel. And you would say Jewish continuity. How do we keep our children Jewish that they don't assimilate? Well, what are we discussing? Anti-Semitism is the safety and the survival of the Jewish people around the world. That the children of Abraham should exist. The state of Israel, and then we said Jewish continuity. They all revolve around these two promises. God said we're going to have the land of Israel, but doesn't mean we're not going to have to fight for it in every generation. Doesn't mean we're not going to have an IDF protecting it every day for survival. Doesn't mean there are not going to be endless threats against the state of Israel. God said we're going to have a Jewish nation. Children will be like the stars in heaven. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be anti-Semitism, that we're going to have to fight constantly. It doesn't mean that our children are naturally going to marry Jews and stay Jewish. We have to work hard to keep our children Jewish and our grandchildren Jewish. In other words, we think a promise sometimes means, okay, God, you said you're going to do it, deliver it. I'll sit back and wait. No. When God makes a promise, he means if you partner with me and work together with me, together we'll make this happen. And that's the story of Avram Avinu and the promises God made him and the challenge we face till today in preserving the two promises, children, continuity, and possession of the land of Israel. Thank you all for joining and have a wonderful, wonderful day. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon, God willing. Take care. Bye.